Well, hello and welcome to this history panel discussion to discuss and commemorate the 80th anniversary of the Battle of St Valery. We've been commemorating the events around about June 1940 and the service and the sacrifice of the Highland Division at St Valery. We have been engaging young people across the country in learning resources around about the period of the Second World War and the specific events we are commemorating through this discussion tonight. And we've also been fundraising for 3 armed forces charities who support the work of armed forces communities today: Poppy Scotland, Legion Scotland, and the Royal Caledonian Education Trust, which is Scotland's Armed Forces children's charity. I'm absolutely delighted that we have what can only be described as an esteemed panel here to join us this evening to engage in discussions about the events of June 1940. I'd like to introduce the panel before we start our discussions. Sitting in my bottom left of the screen, John Lowe is a retired head teacher from Perth and Kinross. He has been a champion and advocate of remembrance, and particularly remembrance of St Valery. His father, Jack Lowe, was a St Valery veteran. We'll hear more from John later about the experiences of his father and about remembrance. John, thank you for joining us here tonight.
Welcome, it's lovely to be here.
Sitting to my left, Professor Saul David is an academic military historian. He is an author and broadcaster, and he is the author of After Dunkirk, Churchill's Sacrifice of the Highland Division. Saul, very warm welcome. Delighted you could join us here tonight.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Thank you. And to my right, Brigadier Charles Grant. Brigadier Charles Grant, again, a champion and an advocate of remembrance, a former 51 Brigade commanding officer, and also the historian of the 51st Highland Division website. Brigadier Grant, thank you for joining us.
Pleasure.
And to my bottom right, Stuart Hepburn. Stuart's play, The Beaches of St Valery, you will have seen as part of our broadcast to schools and also for adult learners, which vividly captures the accounts of so many who were involved in the battle and helps to share it with young people today. Stuart, thank you for your support, not only tonight, but also this week. It's been absolutely fantastic.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So we have a discussion this evening. I'm sure we'll not run short of things to discuss. We have a limited time, but we have a number of key areas to cover. I guess as a starting point, Brigadier Grant, how do we set the events that we're commemorating on the 12th of June into the context of the First World War? How do we get from Britain declaring war to the point where we have Highland Division soldiers on French soil? How do we get to that position?
I think we need to start in 1939. As war became imminent, the cry went out to double the strength of the Territorial Army. This happened throughout the country with enormous success. In the Highlands, there was little problem in literally doubling each of the Territorial Army battalions, and indeed all the subsidiary units like the artillery and the engineers. The end result was that rather than having one division, there were 2 divisions, the 51st Highland Division and the 9th Scottish Division, which was a mirror image of the 51st. It's worth me just spending a minute, if I may, to say what a division is. In very broad terms, roughly 20,000 men, with all the ancillaries, equipment, everything that goes to make a fighting force. This was essentially an infantry division and therefore didn't have armor or tanks. The basis of the division are 9 infantry battalions. They were each of those battalions was from a Highland regiment. And by the time they got to St Valery, there were 6 TA and 3 regular battalions.
And across the Highlands and across North of Scotland, every community is represented there. What are the regiments? Who are involved in the 51st Highland Division?
There were nine, as I say, nine battalions. They came from the Seaforth Highlanders, Cameron Highlanders, the Gordon Highlanders, the Argyll and Southern Highlanders, and the Black Watch. As I say, these only constituted about 9,000 of the 20,000. The additional ones were made up by artillery regiments, engineer regiments, medical organizations, signals, communications, and transport. The vast majority were recruited from the Highlands, and they were territorial soldiers. But there were, in addition, some elements that came from England that also supported and were part of the division. The division actually disappeared from its training off to France in early 1940, but very quickly, instead of remaining with the British Expeditionary Force, it went down to the Saar, to the Maginot Line, hundreds of miles away. And that is really where they were when the rest of the British Expeditionary Forces faced the German advance, which actually ended up penning them into Dunkirk and the evacuation. Just before the evacuation started, completely unknown, or it was completely unknown to the 51st Highland Division, the 51st Highland Division got orders to move from the Maginot Line, and they went both by a train and vehicle. And so by the beginning of June, they find themselves just behind a line in support again and part of the French force defending the line of the Somme.
And as we approach towards St Valery itself, how did we end up with soldiers on the edges of St Valery? How did we get to that particular point?
Well, I'm sure that other members of the panel can give a graphic explanation, but in very brief terms, on the 4th of June, the 51st Highland Division was involved in the French attack to try and drive the Germans who had established a bridgehead at Abbeville. And the attack was unsuccessful. They were facing overwhelming odds. And from then on, you've got a gradual withdrawal of the 51st Highland Division, who were occupying an area probably from the English Channel to 25 miles inland, but were having to keep pace with the French army, who were rather less vehicle-borne and therefore more slow-moving. And so they fell back fighting all the way. They lost significant casualties long before they got to St Valery. For example, the 7th Argylls were virtually all but destroyed at Franleur on the 5th of June. So by the 10th of June, they are approaching St Valery, and they're still hoping that they can get back across the Seine. But Rommel is moving so fast that he actually cuts the line of communications. Part of the division, something called Art Force, gets away to Le Havre, but the remainder, 2/3 division, probably 8,000 men, end up in a pocket around the lovely fishing port of St Valery in a three-sided square with the English Channel to their backs, waiting for the evacuation that sadly never happened.
And that account is captured very, very well on your website. It's also captured by Eric Linklater and his account of the Highland Division. And then more recently, Cyril, your own account is fulsome on that. I guess as a starting point, Cyril, this was your first book, so it's a precious book to you. What connected you with the story? What was the link for you to pick up this particular tale?
It was one of those serendipitous moments that sometimes happens. I was 24, 25, I think, at the time, and working as a journalist, but had done a history degree, always intended to write history, looking for a good subject, and in discussion with my stepmother's father, who was a captain in the Lothian and Borders Yeomanry, which was the reconnaissance regiment. I mean, Charles quite rightly said that a division of this type, an infantry division, doesn't have tanks, but it does have some light armor, and these were light tanks that Pat Turkin, my step grandfather, was in. And it's interesting when Charles talks about the story of the Highlanders finally ending up at St Valery. One of the reasons they were there is because of Pat's action. He was in a tank that was sent on a reconnaissance mission to make sure that the the withdrawal to Le Havre, which was the plan at this stage, on about the 9th and 10th of June, the plan was to get to Le Havre. They already knew they couldn't get across the Seine, which is where the French command were trying to direct them, but the Seine crossings had either been blown or they were intercepted by German troops, and therefore Pat's job was to make sure that the crossings on the River Derden, which was on the western side of St Valery, were clear, and it's there that he was, his tank was knocked out and he was badly injured. And what that told the division, and the reason it's significant as a story in the book, is because it's the moment when they realize they can't withdraw any further and that St Valery is their last hope. But in his stories to me over the dinner table, the first thing I said to myself, and I was someone who'd read a lot of history as a boy, is why do I not know this story? I'm sure we're going to get into that a little bit about the remembrance later, but it really struck me that a lot of the history of this period really stops at Dunkirk. And because Dunkirk was turned from, of course, a defeat into a great victory, quite understandably, snatching those 300,000 or so men from the jaws of disaster, this later mishap, shall we say, the loss of one of the most famous fighting divisions in the British Army, was very much under the radar. And I think it was under the radar not just because it would have taken a little bit of the tarnish off Dunkirk, but also because, as I try to point out in my book, there were moments, I think, where decisions were taken to leave the Highland Division fighting on in a battle it couldn't win, and for a political end that it was unlikely to achieve.
And that strikes me on reading and rereading this book. I know there's a long discussion about the title of your book, Churchill's Sacrifice of the Highland Division. I have a post-it note that I've moved onto the inside because my own sense from reading it was we could equally have said the French failure and the sacrifice of the Highland Division, or French folly. We could have renamed it. How did you get to the point of that particular title? I know it's been discussed regularly on Twitter this week, and I've seen the responses to that. Where do we get to with that?
It wasn't my idea as a title, actually. I was thinking of originally St Valery. It had been used by previous books, of course, but the publishers, quite understandably, wanted as controversial a title as possible. I never would have agreed to the title if I didn't feel it was justified. The inclusion of the word Churchill was probably the one unfortunate thing, actually. I felt it should have just been the sacrifice of the Highland Division. Now, I need to make an important point here. There is a big distinction between Churchill or indeed the British government making decisions that meant that the likelihood of the Highland Division getting away was unlikely on the one hand, and them deliberately wanting the Highland Division to be captured. I don't argue in the book, although I leave it open as a possibility that that might be the case. With the benefit of 20 years on, I certainly don't believe there was a deliberate policy to sacrifice the Highland Division, but it was certainly sacrificed on the altar of political expediency because, as Brooke quite clearly told the British High Command when he was directed to reform the 2nd BEF, and he would, in effect, if he'd got there in time, have become the Highland Division's new Expeditionary Force commander, said quite clearly to the High Command, there is no justification for sending a 2nd BEF there. Any British troops who are there really should be got out, because what you're hoping to achieve, which is to keep the French fighting, is extremely unlikely. And it got even more unlikely as this battle, the battle the Highlanders were fighting in, unfolded. So the question is, when do you take the opportunity to get them out? Because there were some very good soldiers in that division, including my step-grandfather, who were never going to be given the opportunity to show what they could do later on in the war. And as Charles quite rightly pointed out, the 9th Division was the division that became the reformed 51st Division and did fantastically well in the desert. And we don't have any doubt that the original Highland Division would have performed well if it had had the opportunity.
Absolutely. Let's sorry, Charles.
I agree with absolutely with what Saul says. And as I told him earlier, his book has been my handbook on 7 battlefield tours, and it is full of the most wonderful quotes. And I accept the political expedience, but I think also, if I might, from one of my past inclinations as a doctrinaire, writing military doctrine, and looking at what was going on, the quotes that the French give, the speed of Rommel's movement was way beyond what they expected. And so there were things happening that people just weren't able to react quickly enough for. And one of the French commanders, I believe, actually said to Montgomery, "You just moved too quickly for us." And I think when we come to look at actually St Valery, I think one of the most telling things about not really understanding the German tactics and how fast they were moving is that on the western side, one of the battalions there had its anti-tank guns taken away to go to the eastern side of what they thought was the battlefield, where the Germans were coming from. And lo and behold, 80 German tanks come through that side in the mid-morning. So I accept the political part, but I also think that the speed of the German activity was such that the French command and therefore the British command weren't really sure what was going on.
And let's just clarify that for moving between strategic and then to the operational of what's happening in St Valery. So we'll place in context the position and the decision making that Churchill and senior commanders were making at that time back in London related to the war effort.
Yeah, so by the beginning of June, they have made a decision that they are going to reform the BEF, as I already explained. They're going to send Alan Brooke, who becomes, probably the most famous British general of the Second World War. They probably hasn't been recognized as that. He goes on to become Chief of Imperial General Staff, and Brooke is told, you will reform the new BEF. The 51st Highland Division will be part of it, the 52nd Lowland Division, the 1st Armoured Division. It's going to be a sizable force. And he quite clearly makes the point, which I've already made, which is he doesn't believe that that's going to do any good. Now, the reason the British government is so determined to do that is because it's in a desperate situation, and we have to recognize that. So you can criticize the last few days of the movement of the Highland Division and whether there was an opportunity to get them out. You cannot criticize Churchill for taking a chance in keeping the French in the war. Things were desperate. We didn't know what was going to happen next. And he was probably right to take that risk. But there comes a point in the next week when, and Charles is quite right, the Germans did move incredibly quickly, but then again, they'd done exactly the same thing in the Dunkirk campaign. It was almost a mirror image in the way that they hooked round a force. They got in between, they hooked round it, and they cut off its line of withdrawal. And given that they knew that Rommel and his and another of the armored divisions, the 5th Panzer Division, was moving incredibly quickly to the south of the Highland Division, they must have been aware that they needed to take priority to try and get them away, certainly if they couldn't get across the Seine. And it all happened too late. Charles, of course, is right. In wartime, when things are moving at a fast pace, decisions are often taken too late. But in my view, there are crucial moments where other decisions could have been taken. First point is, on the 9th of June, it is quite clear, both the War Office in London and General Fortune, the commander of the Highland Division, are well aware that they can no longer get over the Seine crossings. And yet, even as late as the afternoon of the 11th of June, the War Office is sending signals to Fortune in St Valery to stick to the French plan to withdraw his troops across the Seine. Why? They knew perfectly well there was no chance for him to do it, but they did not want the French to accuse the Highland Division of leaving them in the lurch, which is what had happened at Dunkirk. They were so determined that they wouldn't be accused of that they were prepared, in my view, to risk extremely high likelihood to risk losing the Highland Division.
I mean, the point you just made was the one I was going to ask you about. Do you think that Churchill was influenced by the fact that the French clearly thought there had been an act of betrayal by the withdrawal at Dunkirk, and that in a way would colour political decisions for the next weeks?
I do think that's the case, Charles. I think it's one of the reasons why, age 25, 26, when I wrote this book, I speculated on the possibility of there being a deliberate policy to sacrifice the Highland Division. So they could say, they knew the French admired the Highland Division from the First World War, so they could say the Highland Division did not desert you. We also know now that de Gaulle would say many years later, it was the act of the Highland Division in fighting on alongside the French that actually one of the factors that encouraged him to keep fighting and to leave and set up the Free French. So it's not beyond the realms of possibility. I still don't believe there was a deliberate policy to sacrifice them, but I do believe that they were left in an incredibly difficult position from which they were unlikely to escape. And that's why I stand by the original title of the book, which was The Sacrifice. They were sacrificed for political ends. Whether you feel that's justified or not is a different debate. I don't criticize Churchill, with the benefit of a little bit more knowledge as a historian, for taking that decision, because he was in a desperate situation. And what would the rest of us have done? You had to hope against hope that the French, even if the battle for France had been lost, would keep fighting somehow, somewhere.
And some of that debate I'd like to come back to, and Charles, I'd particularly like to come back to later, the speed of the advance and what they were against there. But if you place it back again to, we now have this box formation around about St Valery. John, your father was there. He, like many, I presume, did not speak about it after the war immediately, but you have perhaps one of the finest accounts of the events from a recording you took from your father later in life.
Yeah, he never, like many, he never spoke about it at the time. And in his latter years, when his father died in 2004, so the late 90s, we gave him a cassette player and blank cassette tapes. He was a carer for my mother by that stage. She had a bit of dementia. So in the evenings, he would put her to bed and he would sit in the lounge and talk his life story to the cassette and the cassette tapes. The life story, I mean, he goes from 1919 all the way through to 1960, but obviously a big element is what happened to him during the war. And we have that in his own words. And it's a fascinating insight, absolutely fascinating. The bit that kind of makes you scream almost at times is when he says, you know, there was such and such was happening. I won't tell you the detail about that. You wouldn't be interested. And you feel like saying, you know, of course you'd be interested. But it does give a great insight. So it was recorded for his grandchildren. I've since then translated the tape into digital and very happily shared it with as many people as I can. And it does show, it's the opposite end from what Saul and Charles have been talking about. My dad was just at he was a Lance Corporal in the Queen's on Cameron Highlanders. He was just at the operational end. He was there to do his job and follow orders and instructions. And he just went, he arrived at St Valery as all these men did. And to be honest, I take my hat off to people like Sir General Fortune and so on. These guys must have virtually not slept at all for days and days, particularly the officers. And they got them as far as St Valery, and albeit exhausted, and having lost lots of men, but still in good shape in the sense of discipline and determination. And they were determined to hang on. And I think, some of you have heard my dad's poetry. And one of the things he talks about was when the initial thing goes up, the white flag goes up, and the men's determination is, no, they're not stopping now. They want to continue to fight until the officers come round and say that's it. So, my dad was very much the operational side and saw and heard some horrible things of which he talks about. So, which I'll happily explain a wee bit more detail later on.
Well, Stuart, you both looked at multiple accounts of the soldiers at St Valery on the 11th and 12th. How do you describe the particular events of those 2 days, and particularly through the eyes of the soldiers who were caught up in what was a horrendous set of circumstances that was starting to envelop around about them?
Is that for me?
Please, Stuart, yeah.
My whole story about the lead up to St Valery really came about through one individual soldier whom I found out about through listening to Ian MacDonald talking on the radio. So the soldier I was really interested in was a man called Arthur Fraser from the 4th Camerons, and the story of what happened to him. And I think he arrived maybe round about the 10th and went down the cliffs and went across the shingle beach and sheltered in a house in the last night with some sea force, I think. And they couldn't believe it when the young sub-lieutenant who was with them couldn't believe the signal on the radio that they were being told to put down their arms on the day it happened. But he told me, and he remembers that he heard them swearing over the line on the RT when they were actually told to do it. And the sub-lieutenant asked for a higher higher officer in the command to come across and tell them what the situation was. He described that night as when they woke up in the morning, all they could hear was the clink, clink, clink of soldiers digging in, and digging in, and they were prepared to keep on going. But of course, they were down to their last bullets, and there was General Fortune took the very brave but wise decision to. So it was through Arthur Fraser from the 4th Battalion that I heard the story now, as well as Saul did. I know he did, because Valerie Fraser told me you did. You went up and saw Helene and Arthur in Culloden. In Culloden, and talked to them before they sadly passed away, and I did exactly the same thing because I found their story absolutely fascinating. Can I just say something about? There's two things I want to say about the discussion that's happened so far. I don't necessarily see sacrifice as a pejorative term. I think they were sacrificed, but it was war, and the war had to be won. And in order for de Gaulle to be kept in the war, they felt that they needed to make a grand gesture that they were still in the war, and I think that happened. I don't think it's betrayal. I don't think that Churchill betrayed them. But what happened afterwards was that Churchill, the genius that he was, turned the debacle of Dunkirk into a triumph, and that was a triumph, and it was a triumph of getting those 300,000 men back home alive. They didn't have their guns, some of them didn't have their boots, but he got them back alive. And my goodness me, at that time in the war, the country needed a story which told a good story about the country. The 51st just didn't fit that story. Who wants to tell the story of the 9,000 men who are left behind? We don't want to hear about that. That's not part of the story. And what really motivated me about getting involved in the story is that it continues to this day. I read the BBC website last year. You could read the BBC website about Dunkirk. Not a single mention of St Valery. And that was one of the things that motivated me to write my story, because I wanted these men's story to be told, because it's a story that deserves to be told.
I think that's so important. We're gathered here tonight, and we've got everyone here. We've got across the country and internationally. That this has now moved from a commemoration that a small number knew about to it is now something of significance, and we'll certainly come back to that. In terms of the stories, because that's the important part, that we capture the individual experiences. And you, Stuart, have given a good account there of one of those stories. So you've captured many accounts in this book here. What are the ones that stood out from you from around about the 11th, 12th? There are many stories in here, but some of them are particularly striking.
Well, I think it was really what was happening on the west side of the town, because that's the key moment, really. Rommel's broken through further south. He's then headed up to the coast and cut off the Highlanders. His reconnaissance battalion has reached the River Derwent, and then they're advancing on St Valery itself. And who are they facing on the western flank of the defensive perimeter around St Valery? Two of the regular battalions, interestingly enough, the 2nd Seaforth and the 1st Gordons. And the action that those two battalions fight against almost impossible odds, holding far too much ground, with not enough defensive support, really, from anti-tank guns and artillery. They are spread out. They're really just holding strong points. And against them are sent the armor of Rommel's Panzer Division. So it's in the fighting for those two villages, really, that in many ways, it's the high point of the book, really, because the courage shown by those soldiers, the determination not to give in, the insistence of fighting on even after the actual tanks have got through. And this is really the key point here, Neil. Once those tanks have got through those defensive positions and are onto the high ground to the west of the of the harbour of St Valery, the game is up. There is no chance that you're going to be able to get an evacuation, however brave the Navy were, and they were very brave in attempting to come in that night. And we're talking now about the night of the 11th and 12th of June. But with armour and machine guns up on those high points, there is no way an evacuation could take place. And of course, as we know, those soldiers who did get away got away from Veules-les-Roses, which was a small fishing village a mile or so further to the east. So it's in this action in the villages like Le Thau and Saint-Sylvain that the Sea Force and the Gordons fight for. And then even when, as I say, the tanks have got through and they're bombarding the town, these little enclaves, which are still holding out, are full of soldiers determined to fight on, determined to escape if they can, and a lot of them lose their lives as a result of that. And one of the lovely things I think about history is it never dies, in the sense that new material is always reappearing. And when I was writing the foreword for the latest edition of my book about the Highlanders, I came across a diary that actually was written by someone in the Gordon Highlanders that explained to me for the first time they never received the order to withdraw into the town. So just to give a little bit of context, the plan was the battalions, even those on the perimeters, are supposed to move into the town for the evacuation if the Navy can get there at about 10:30 and thereafter on the night of the 11th of June. And the Gordons never received that order. And what this diary explains, which I was never able to read because I hadn't heard of it when I was doing my research, is that he doesn't name the officer. I could easily identify him if I wanted to. I chose not to, but a brigade intelligence officer failed to deliver the order, and so they never receive it. And that officer in the Gordon Highlanders never forgave that intelligence officer, because he felt that a lot of his fellow officers, or some of them, died as a result of that omission. So a lot of high feeling as a result of what happened on the night of the 11th, but also some incredible bravery and a real feeling that the story is never entirely told. There's always new material coming up.
And a messy story. War is messy. It's a complex environment. I'm glad that you raised the evacuation of some of the troops from Veules-les-Roses, and we have here June Goodfield's Glory from Defeat, our second Dunkirk. June couldn't join us tonight on the panel. However, June has helpfully recorded for us to share a brief excerpt from her book and the story of those who managed to escape.
Hello, I'm June Goodfield, and I'm sorry that my deafness stops me from taking part in the discussion today. But I welcome the opportunity to send you a little brief information about what many of us consider to be one of the most important and wonderful episodes during World War II. This took place in the small little Normandy coastal town of Veules-les-Roses. Unlike St Valery, it doesn't have a harbour. The river just trickles down and pours into the sea. Now, the full account of this has actually been given and is in the book that I've written by Derek Lang. He remembers when they were told to go to make their way to Le Havre, where the boats would evacuate them, and they found that the German soldiers in Rommel had cut off everywhere. So they went to St Valery. It was in flames, but seeing two little ships on the horizon, they decided that they would walk to Veules-les-Roses and see if anything could be done by contacting the ships. It took him 2 hours to walk along the shoreline, and it was a dramatic and a terrible expedition, because many of the Highlanders and the French, Free French, had tried to get down by tying themselves to ropes and getting down the cliffs that way, and many had actually crashed to their deaths. When they got down, Derek Lang's words are much better than mine and can be actually found in the book. But it didn't really work out quite like this. And of the 20,000 soldiers that remained trapped, only 3,200 were taken off. when I learned this story, I spoke to the mayor, and we decided that this was something that should be celebrated, commemorated, and I wrote to Lieutenant Colonel Peter Little in Perth saying this is what we intended to do, and in September 2014 we would have the first event commemorating the liberation, and would he send us a piper perhaps. The delightful colonel rang me. Immediately he got the letter and said, it is very important this gets out into the public domain. I'm going to send you 50 soldiers. 20 will come from Perth, 20 will come from Germany, and that's exactly what we did. And that was for the first time that we realised that there was a special part of the cemetery in Vurley-Rose dedicated to the fallen. And with moving ceremonies there, the soldiers came up with us, and each soldier stood in front of the gravestone, saluted, read out the name, and put down a red rose. Now, the extraordinary thing was that Field Marshal Montgomery, who was not conducting the total liberations on D-Day, asked particularly that the same regiment could go and liberate the town as liberate Vurley-Rose, as this was the town where the attempted evacuation took place. And this is exactly what happened. And Alistair Dorwood, who was there, wrote that no one will ever forget the day. The French went wild with joy, singing God Save the Queen, the King, it was the King then, and having a most marvellous time. But in many ways, the most moving occasion took place 1 year later, in June 2015, when we celebrated, or rather commemorated, the attempt at evacuation after D-Day. This was something that I think none of us will ever forget. And there were commemorative events all over the town laid on by the community. A plaque was unveiled by the mayor and Captain Charles Grant. There was a footpath was renamed Sentier Derek Lang, footpath after Derek Lang, and it was a most moving occasion because not only was his daughter there, but also his grandson and also two of his great-grandchildren. And Sarah, his daughter, has said, we always want to remember the brave attempts of the fishermen from New Haven and Eastbourne and those towns that made the brave attempts to rescue and save my father and his comrades. The other important thing was that later another little square was dedicated to another famous Highlander, Tom Renworth. And all over the town we will see these recollections. And this is why we feel that this particular episode is something that we should pass on to the next generation. Because at this glorious commemorative event, where the children took part, in an area where the community had built a new memorial to the fallen, each school child had a white balloon with the name on it of one of the soldiers or unknown soldier that had died. And they let the balloons off and they sailed away to the east in a glorious, glorious sunny sky. And 4 days later, the mayor of Vurley-Rose got a letter from a lady who lived in the East German border to say one of the balloons had landed in her garden, and she was so moved, and please would he tell her what the particular occasion was. Finally, Charles Anson read out a message from Her Majesty, and then to cap it all, we had a wonderful endorsement of the book of from Dame Vera Lynn. What could be better than that? I wish I was with you today.
Charles, an important part that we are continuing to learn and to add on new knowledge and context to the events. I know that you supported June in the background as well with this particular publication.
Absolutely, and it's been a delight to do so. I mean, June is passionate about this and yet another of the myths of St Valery and the forgotten facts, that actually a significant fleet, over 200 ships, were put together, eventually, probably almost too late, for the evacuation. And June is very much involved with that, and she explains the role, again, of these small ships, a bit like Dunkirk, in her book. She's also, because Alfreton, the town that she's involved with, is twinned with Ville de Roses. She has been there and been at the commemorations, and I've stood with her and looked at that lovely little village, and it's another lovely little village. I've looked at the horrendous cliffs that some of the soldiers tried to get down, stringing together rifle slings and blankets. Some succeeded, and some were actually pulled off, as you rightly say. And June gives a really good description of the involvement of the local civilian ships, as well as the military, and what happened in attempts to get some of the soldiers away.
Charles, getting to that point of the surrender, coming back to the point about the speed of the advance, Rommel describes Fortune as a gallant commander and describes him as a commander who just had bad luck. Is that a fair reckoning of the challenges that Victor Fortune was facing at that time? Just bad luck and the sheer speed and ferocity of Blitzkrieg?
I think that would be true, but it would be an oversimplification. And I'm sure that Saul will have a view. I think that he was constrained by the speed. He was under command of the French. He had to do what the French did. He could only withdraw at their pace, and they were still using wagons and horses to some extent in their logistic support. They didn't have the trucks that the 51st Highland Division had. So by virtue of the fact that he had to go back slowly, and he was fighting withdrawal all the way, meant that he would have ultimately be trapped. Anybody who has to surrender a division in these circumstances might be branded unlucky. But there were so many more contributing factors. And as I say, the French High Command had, and again, Ms. Saul will have a better view of this, a strategic view than I have, but I'm afraid the French High Command was really not functioning. And so information and awareness of the situation was not getting through even to the intermediate levels like the French Corps commander and the divisional commanders.
And John, your father, one of those who surrendered, and he captured vividly not only the horror of that experience and the horror of laying down arms, but also his journey towards prisoner of war camps.
Yeah, and his story is very harrowing. And if I can just go back to the 11th, he talks about on the 11th, in the morning of the 11th, along with some of his comrades, taking some of the wounded down into St Valery and down to the harbour. I've been to St Valery a couple of times myself as well and seen it, and putting the wounded onto a boat which was going to take them out. And as the boat sailed out, as the men were starting to march away from the harbour, they got blown up by shells. One, they were injured and then they get blown up. But all they could do was they had to march back to the front again and get on with it. After the surrender, he talked about them having to march past General Fortune, and understandably how upset General Fortune was. And from there, along with some of the men, my father and some others were given 3 French cavalry horses each. There was about 200 men had them, and they had to take the horses. Dad reckons they did about 200 miles heading northwards up through Belgium with them. He said at some points a lot of them had to just walk because they were so sore sitting on the backs of the horses. They didn't have saddles, obviously. And from there on to barges and taking up the Rhine, they were locked into the hold. And as they went up the Rhine, they came into a German town called Buchholz. And in Buchholz, they were taken off the barges, and their officers had been taken away by that time. So it was the NCOs that were in charge. And the NCOs had straightened them up as best they could and said, remember, you're the British Army. You march. We've only lost a battle. We have not lost a war. We're not entirely defeated or anything like that. But they were then marched into the town, into a football stadium. And Dad said they were marched round and round the stadium. And as they were going round, they were filmed. And he said there was big fat Germans, this is his own words, big fat Germans and German wifeys shouting and spitting at them and throwing things at them. And he said, at that time, we took a bitter dislike to them and nobody could blame us. And I do entirely understand that. And from there on, it was then into the cattle trucks. No facilities in these trucks whatsoever. Men suffering from dysentery, some men dying, and they were on the trucks for days. Occasionally some water was put in until eventually they got to POW camp in Poland. And you know, this was a man, my dad was a big man. He'd been a ploughman in Northeast Fife. He was only 21. He had never been more than 25 miles from his home in his life until that moment when he was called up. And suddenly he's away there. And it's remarkable, not just him, but all these lads, how they actually survived and coped and came back from it.
Could I make, Neil, could I make two points? Well, first of all, which are relevant to what is, first of all, if I pick up on the fighting, and you're really getting a flavour of it, I really commend Saul's book, and he spoke briefly about the Second Seaforths. And I think, if my memory serves me right, they were de facto commanded by Major Grant, who was the grandfather of the actor Hugh Grant. And it's like a boy's own story. I mean, and Saul has captured all of the information from the diary about this running battle and people taking on tanks with tiny little anti-tank weapons, trying to get the injured away, the doctor trying to look after the soldiers, the barn where the injured is burning in Saint-Savin. It really gives a very graphic soldier's view of the battle. The second point is that I wanted to make is that there is a danger that we sort of catapult ourselves from the beginning of June down, suddenly we're at St Valery. And I think the point is worth making again, that these soldiers have fought non-stop. On the 4th of June, the 4th Seaforth and 4th Camerons lost almost half their strength already, and they haven't even started the retreat. The next day, the Argylls, 7th Argylls, lose a huge number, the 8th Argylls quite a lot. So we're dealing with people who aren't just fighting a battle at St Valery, they have been fighting a 7-day battle non-stop.
Absolutely, absolutely. And Stuart, you're trying to pull together something that an audience of today can enter into that surrender and then the experience of prisoner of war camps. And naturally, we young people have been drawing conclusions as part of the materials, the learning materials, that in 2020 we are in lockdown and they may be frustrated at not getting out. That this is something of completely a different scale, and it's been a useful entry point for young people to think about this. How do we capture that experience? How do we capture the experience of somebody who has surrendered and then spends years in a prisoner of war camp?
Well, my story doesn't do that, but I'd like to get a bit of what my story did was to take a boy, an 18-year-old boy, and take him through 8 years, finally from 1938 to 1946. And in 1946, he's a battle-hardened captain who had seen death, destruction, and things that he didn't really want to talk about, but become a man through the whole process with a family and a child. And so it was a story of maturation. It was a story about growing up amidst great loss. I'm about to say, I think that I know quite a few teenagers in my local village here. They're going through a kind of a situation at the moment, and I don't like the war analogy to do with COVID particularly, but these are difficult times for young people, a very, very important time in their development. And it's very, very challenging to grow up in a time of crisis. And that's what I wanted to capture. But I mean, what I did was I joined two stories together, Neil. So I joined together Hugh's, I found out first of all about Hugh Oliver and Neil Campbell. That's what drew me in. Campbell for South US that stole a boat and rowed back across the channel. And what happened to me was I thought, what a wonderful story. Because I'm always looking for stories. I'm a dramatist. I'm not a historian, I'm a dramatist. And I just thought, this man who stole a boat and rowed across the channel. And I spoke to Ian MacDonald, and Ian MacDonald says, that's not the real story. There's a better story than that. And it was a story. It was a story of Arthur Fraser and what happened to him. And he escaped. He never went to he never went to Poland or any of that. He escaped and he stayed in northern France for a year in Auchel, and helped the miners there and helped the Maquis to smuggle POWs and soldiers away. He helped Douglas Bader to escape, and then he went himself down south and down to Gibraltar, returned up to Inverness, and then eventually retrained and went to Burma actually. So I took his story, and then I found out about Tommy Rennie and Derek Lang and what had happened to them. A few of the men who'd escaped, Derek Lang escaped twice, went back, were part of the reformed D-Day forces. D+1, there they were on the beach. And on the 2nd of September 1944, Montgomery sorted it so that they marched into St Valery and liberated the town. So I took both those stories and joined them together to give it an idea of a story of triumph and hope amongst horror and war. And that's what I tried to do with my story.
And for those who are looking for the book, there we go. Return to St Valery is Derek Lang's account of his own escape. So you capture, towards the end of your own book, a number of escape stories, which are in some regards are boys' own stories in terms of, some of the tales and adventures of cycling and different ways in which they are evading capture.
Yeah, it was extraordinary, really. I mean, I could have picked any one of those stories and written another half book, even a whole book, really. I think one of the most striking statistics I came across was when I was looking at the MI9 papers, which were the papers put together by the department, which set up by the British Army to facilitate escapes, basically. And in those MI9 papers, it talks about roughly 300 soldiers, both from Dunkirk and also from the other BEF, the BEF that the Highland Division is involved in, the second BEF, in other words. And of those 300 soldiers who escaped, more than half of them were from the Highland Division. In other words, the Highland Division completely outpunched its weight in terms of numbers. So you had an awful lot of people who were not prepared to go into captivity that easily. We've already heard the story about the two who crossed, Neil Oliver and Campbell, who crossed in the boat. There are so many like that. They go across the channel. They go down to right down to the south, like Arthur Fraser. They get across that way. Derek Lang went over to, I think he went over to French North Africa before he finally got his freedom. Bill Bradford, who I met shortly before the end of his life, another great character. And of course, by escaping, it meant that a lot of these men were able to contribute to the war. Something that, and I should quickly say this, I want to make a quick distinction between the officers and the other ranks in prisoner of war camps. The officers, of course, had a much cushier ride, and I mean that in inverted commas because it's comparative. It was still a brutal experience to be 5 years in prisoner of war camp. Particularly if you're a regular soldier, you've lost all opportunity, which is what war gives a soldier, of advancing in your career. So you had people who were literally languishing there as second lieutenants until their mid-20s, their late 20s. on the other hand, you had some of the people I've spoken about who were able to do extraordinary things, like Bill Bradford. He wins a couple of DSOs, if I remember rightly, like Derek Lang, who goes on to become a lieutenant general later on in his career, because he was able to escape. But the second point to make about the prisoners of war is, I really felt sympathetic, and I was always seriously considering writing a book about prisoners of war, actually, because of the number of other ranks I heard, that is the non-officers, who had a much, much tougher time, because they were expected to effectively hard labor. It was a bit like a penal sentence with hard labor. And when you got into Eastern Europe, in the salt mines and the rock mines that they were expected to work in, the conditions were absolutely brutal. Not as bad, of course, as some of the other prisoners of the Germans, but bad nonetheless. And the last point to make about prisoners of war is they don't know how long their sentence is. A bit like lockdown, actually, getting back to our earlier comparison. You don't know how long it's going to last, and that takes its toll on people. And the fact that they came out in any kind of sane state of mind is really testament to the extraordinary endurance of those people, and the hardiness, frankly, of men from the Highlands of Scotland.
Yeah, can I maybe come in here? I think it's more than that as well. I think it was to do with the comradeship and camaraderie that was in these camps, that was built up, which was, we look after each other. One of the things my dad said in his story was, in the camps, nobody stole from anybody else. They just didn't, but they looked after. When some people, in his terms, he said, sometimes you got a bit blue, but your friends would chivvy you up, keep you going until you got back on your feet. Because they were isolated, they didn't have communications from home. I know his parents believed he was dead for the first 4 months, until eventually the message came through. But they looked after each other in the camps, and that's how they built up a different way of living. So it must have been extraordinarily difficult, the other end of it, coming back, Saul, where they actually returned home, and suddenly that whole massive support network that they had in the camps had disappeared, and it had these immensely long years of being treated very badly. The other thing Dad did say, one of the things, was the fact that many of them, the majority of them, whilst they didn't steal from each other, became amazingly adept at stealing things from anywhere else. He talked about going round the bins, round the back of the Wehrmacht, the prison guards' kitchens, and taking turns raking the bins to see what they could find, stealing things from the fields, potatoes and so on. One he did talk about was being sent to unload fish down at a harbour, and there were salt fish, and he managed to steal 2 and tie them with a bootlace, so they hung under his shirt, and they marched back to the camp. He said he was so emaciated at the time that these hard fish rubbed on his bones. The salt was absolute agony, and when he got in, of course, he would have been shot if they'd found him, but he got back into the camp. He said, but he never enjoyed fish soup so much in his life. It was just wonderful. They managed to get back, and of course, it was shared with all his pals in that area. So it was, the comradeship was so strong that they looked after each other. I think that was one of the things that made the big difference.
And that links well into the format of our commemoration this year, given we are socially restricted and we are separated out by the current circumstances, is a musical commemoration where across the world people will unite playing a single piece of music. But music and poetry filtered into that as well, to keep spirits high and to keep minds active as well. Your own father was obviously involved in capturing his experiences through poetry as well.
Yeah, my dad's, as I say, he wasn't a highly educated man. He left school at the age of 14 and then went to work on a farm. But when he was in the POW camp, in his own words, he said he found it was a way to express himself that he couldn't express himself in any other way. And, he brought, like a lot of these guys, he brought a lot of photos back. I don't know how they got all these photos. He never explained all that, but there's some of the different bands that were on in the camp. There was football, there were plays, there were talks given, and so on. So they all went and learnt and kept doing things. But in my dad's context, he wrote some poetry. He didn't write a huge number of poems. Well, of the ones I've got anyway, I've got about 15 in a small booklet. but they were hugely insightful. And the one which some of you already have heard, where the poem without a title, where he talks about how he can set his mind free and meet his old friends, the ones that have passed away, that have been killed, and they're saying, keep your spirits up. You know, we've done our bit. Now it's up to you to carry the flag and carry things through and make sure that things are better in the future. It's a really strong image and strong message. And I say, it's the fact that not just my dad, but there was all these young men, a completely different experience of life than anything they'd ever experienced before, but they stuck together, they held it together. And I think that was one of the great things about that whole, I can't think of the right word, Charles, it's not a mystique, but that whole thing of the British Army, about being the British Army, about holding together and doing it together and sticking together. And I think that was one of the things that kind of helped the glue that held things together for them.
Is that a uniqueness, Charles, of the British Army then and now, that camaraderie and that spirit?
Totally. I mean, totally. I mean, I think almost the bottom line is that soldiers today and soldiers in the past, yes, they fight for Queen, they fight for country, and they fight for regiment, and they fight for this and that, but they fight for each other. They're a band of brothers, you know, and that's what holds them together in adversity. And I think that comes over in exactly what John said. It's that band of brothers that binds people in a really difficult situation together and makes ordinary people do extraordinary things.
So we have this band of brothers, this group of extraordinary men of the Highland Division. Stuart, you've had a battle in your own hands trying to get this story out. And we've got there this year, but talk us through it. It's been a real passion of yours for many years since your own studies up until now.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a dramatist. I write plays. I'm a teacher too. I teach screenwriting, but I write plays and screenplays. And I wanted the Beaches of St Valery to be my fourth feature film. When I obviously it was Campbell and Oliver that drew me in, but then I met Arthur Fraser and found out about Derek Lang and Tommy Rennie and what they had done and put the thing together, and I attempted to fund it. Scott Meek, a friend of mine, was going to produce it. We'd both worked together on Hamish Macbeth, and we tried for 5 years to raise the money for a major motion picture, and we never really could get the traction. We could never get it done. It was ironic. Band of Brothers had 120 million pounds spent on it, and that was one of the reasons why we couldn't get money for the Beaches of St Valery. But hope sprung eternal, and when it came to the point about doing a PhD, Willie Maley at Glasgow University at the School of Critical Studies was very, very supportive of me, and I transformed it and turned it into a novel. And then Orrin Moore asked me, do you think you'd turn your screenplay into a three-hander? And that's what I did. So I turned this epic, huge £100 million movie into a three-hander. And do you know what? It didn't do any harm at all, I think. I'm very proud. I'm very proud of my Orrin Moore story and my three wonderful, wonderful actors, Ashley, James and Ron, who are all wonderful in the piece. I'm very, very proud of it indeed. We've got to keep telling the stories. That's the thing. It's the stories, you know, like the poetry and the letters and all that. It's the stories that keep the memory alive, and hopefully will lead us to a place where we don't commit this sort of folly again. That's the one thing I would want to say to the young people of today, you know. Don't make the mistakes of the past. Try to stop war. And no one wants to die in a war. And in order to understand that, we have to understand the stories of those who didn't manage to make it through, but those who also did, and showing amazing feats of bravery and resilience.
And that's maybe a good point for us to get some last reflections. Here we are, the 80th anniversary of St Valery. Across the country, it is being commemorated. Indeed, across the world. We know we've got papers from every corner of the world, almost every continent, who have been, their interest has been piqued by this story, and their willingness to join us in commemorating the service and sacrifices there. How do you want today to have been remembered, and how do you want St Valery to be remembered as we go forward? So, Will, what's your own thoughts on that in terms of how we remember it going forward?
I think we've come a long way, actually. I take the point that some of the other panelists have made that, you know, sometimes it's still forgotten, even last year with the Dunkirk commemorations. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, I think we've come a long way from the point at which I started my research. And I'm not saying it's down to me. A lot of people, everyone here has been involved and has played their part. But in the mid-90s, when I started research on this book, hardly anyone in England, for example, had heard of this story. And quite a few people in Scotland hadn't heard of it either. And yet, I think, you know, the 80th commemoration, it's wonderful to hear that it's had such reach across the world, because it is one of the great stories of the Second World War. It's tragedy, it's got resilience, it's got redemption. The fact that the Highland division was actually moved, as was already explained by Charles, I think it was earlier, to recapture St Valery, to actually be the first boots on the ground inside that town when it was recaptured from the Germans. It's a wonderful story. And then the prisoners of war and the escapes and the individual actions by Highlanders were remarkable. They always have been in wartime. They obviously were after the Second World War. But this, I think, is one of the great episodes. And although it's a tragedy, there was also a lot of good that came out of it too.
Charles, your own website rightly says there wasn't a town, village or hamlet that was unaffected, and families in those areas still talk about the sacrifice and the experience of men who went through it. This year, it's across the country. People are thinking about that. What's your own thoughts on remembrance this year and as we go forward?
I think a couple of things I'd like to point out. You're absolutely right. And I was fortunate enough to cover the length and breadth of the Highlands when I was looking after cadets and TA later on in my career. And one of the things I was struck with, there isn't a monument in any village or town which doesn't have that date and the name, and it might be MacLeod, or Mackenzie, or whatever it is. And that village was seriously affected by what happened at St Valery and the loss of the division. And it is very important, I think, and they will remember when they get the pipers who are coming out, and I'll talk a bit in a minute about the pipers. The other thing I hope we can try and do is give this a wider context. It isn't just a parochial Highland. It isn't even just a parochial Scottish thing. We've got a battalion of Norfolks. We've got a battalion of Northumberland Fusiliers. We've got the Kensington Reconnaissance Regiment. We've got a battery of Welsh gunners involved. And then there are a lot of other bits and pieces that had been in France that got swept along with the 51st Highland Division, which weren't initially part of them. So it isn't just a Scottish issue. I mean, it isn't just a Highland issue. This is something that happened to the British Army. The second thing, and because we're doing, I think it's such a wonderful idea to get the pipers out and to mark it. And I thought, you know, the importance of the pipes cannot be underestimated. I've got this quote, which is taken from the attack of the 4th Camerons on the 4th of June. We heard the whistle blow and then the bagpipes, and soon we saw Piper Mackay coming out, leading advanced troops of D Company. The Germans were waiting, and until 50 yards up, and then they opened with the Spandaus from the group of trees to the front. The piper was the first man down. That's what the pipers did, you know, and to get them all out on the anniversary reflects the strength of the Highland tradition, Scottish tradition in the pipes and drums. We then go on from there, and we know that in the prisoner of war camp, the reel of the 51st Highland Division was written. We have the commemorations at the end of the war with the mass pipes and drums. It's such an emblematic thing, and I think it's such a wonderful thing that is going to happen on the anniversary this year. And I hope with the coverage we get, it'll really raise the profile.
Absolutely, and you've got your piper in the background there. Would you like to share just a bit on the pipe tune that is going to be played at 10 o'clock, and I'm sure will resonate out beyond them? We had a number of discussions about various pipe tunes. At one point we were looking at different regimental marches, but we weren't going to enter into that territory where there's disputes between the different regiments, but we've settled on a pipe tune that is a strong story behind it.
And I think that is very appropriate. But and yes, we can all laugh about should we be playing the regimental march or the pipes for this, and what does it mean? And you and I have discussed the fact even that in the Gordon Highlanders they don't even have pipes and drums; they have drums and pipes. We've all got our foibles. The important thing is that people will come out on the 12th and play. And actually, I don't care what they play, as long as they come out and demonstrate in the towns and villages and hamlets, the commemoration of the anniversary.
Absolutely. John, you kick-started in many ways the discussion about raising the profile and raising awareness of this as we approach the 80th. What's your own reflections of that? And also, what would your father have made of all this?
Oh, my dad would find this amazingly entertaining and funny. He always had a good laugh about things as well. And I think, you look back and a lot of these lads that they came through, they kept their spirits up one way or the other, but they knew how to have a good time when the opportunity was there. So my dad would have loved this. I think that from my point of view, I think one of the great things about what we're doing at the moment is, as one or two people said there, we're filling a gap of history that has not been recognised or really noted much. And I think it's just a wee bit of redressing things, brightening it up. I was actually looking at a book today. I can't even tell you who published it, but it was the first book, the Second World War, by years. So I've only got the 1941, and it's the Second World War, 1940 in pictures. And at the top of each page, it gives dates. And you can go right through this, and I've got the date. There's bits from the 4th of June to the 17th of June, I think it is. Tells you all the things that have happened. St Valery doesn't get a mention. So, but it was published round about time. We are filling this gap in. I think we're doing a great job, and I think the men up there would be immensely proud of it. I think they were great characters. As many from other backgrounds in different areas where my father talked very strongly about the RSM that was in charge of the prisoner of war camp. He was in an RSM Jolly who was from the Norfolks, and just what a decent, hard-working guy he was, but everybody respected him, although you didn't cross him. But I think, great characters. We're filling a space that's been left by history, and I think they would love the fact that it's been recognised and just appreciate what the efforts we're making.
Gentlemen, thank you. Thank you for your inputs tonight. Thank you for your support of the commemoration. Saul, Charles, Stuart, John, much appreciated. We've seen commemoration throughout today. We've seen learning resources throughout today. And we've also seen a charitable aspect in terms of supporting the armed forces community of today. We'd ask you continue to follow the updates from our official charity websites from Poppy Scotland, Legion Scotland, and the Royal Caledonian Education Trust. And if you would like to donate to those charities, please type Piper and text Piper into your phone to the number 70007. So 70007. Text Piper, and your donation will be gratefully received by those three charities. Normal standard network rates apply, and you can text as many times as you would like if you so wish to support those charities. Gentlemen, it's been a great insight tonight. We thank you very, very much once again.
Thank you.
Cheers.